Okay. This is the Broke Millionaire, and I'm here with who many consider to be the GOAT of FI, the legend, the Godfather of FI, Mr. JL Collins. JL, how are you today?
Oh, I'm doing great, Rashad. It's an honor to be here with you. Thanks for inviting me back.
Hey, the honor is all mine. So, for those who don't know, JL Collins, he actually started a blog called it's jlcollinsnh.com. He wrote the legendary book, The Simple Path to Wealth, which so many people have followed and gotten out of debt. And they're actually on their way to financial independence because of the book. There are plenty of stories, plenty of videos of people who had no idea where they were financially until they read that book. And he also wrote a book that is called How I Lost Money in Real Estate Before It Was Fashionable, which I have a personal story I think that kind of goes along with that. But JL is definitely a voice of reason. He is the soothing and calming voice in the financial independence community, and it's always been a pleasure to have him here. I watched an interview of you with Brad from Choose FI, and he said that this book, The Pathfinders, what we're here to talk about today, it is not necessarily a sequel to The Simple Path to Wealth, but it's like a companion to the sequel, The Simple Path of Wealth. And when he said that, I said, that makes a lot of sense. Where The Simple Path to Wealth kind of taught you the basic steps to how to get out of debt and become financially independent. This book actually tells the stories of people who have done that. So I think I've rambled on enough. I have about 2,000 followers or subscribers on YouTube right now. So I'm getting up there slowly but surely, but there are quite a bit of people who may not have seen our previous interviews. But for those who haven't, I would love for you to introduce yourself.
Sure. So you gave me a great introduction already. I mean, I'm J.L. Collins, and I've written 3 books at this point. The Simple Path to Wealth was the first, and then How I Lost Money in Real Estate Before It Was Fashionable, and now Pathfinders just came out a couple of months ago at the end of October. And Pathfinders is a collection of about 100 stories that range from just a few paragraphs to a few pages from people who have read The Simple Path to Wealth, embraced the concepts in it, and have applied it to their own lives. And these are their stories of how they've done it. And, you mentioned Brad had said it's kind of a good companion to The Simple Path to Wealth. And I think that's true. But it's also probably the better introductory book to the whole concept. So people tell me all the time that they buy The Simple Path to Wealth to give to friends and family because they think it's so valuable. And I think that's wonderful. But Pathfinders might even be more inspirational for people who are new to this whole concept, because it's people all over the world, all different walks of life, who have embraced this approach and are doing it successfully. And I think it's incredibly inspirational. And so if you read Pathfinders first, you're going to learn that this can be done. This is achievable by virtually anyone, who's certainly anyone listening to us. And then with that inspiration, if it resonates with you, then you can turn to The Simple Path to Wealth, which is kind of the how-to manual, right? It's how exactly do you do what these people in Pathfinders have done and are doing.
Hey, that's interesting. So if you are new to the financial space and you're drowning in debt and you just need somewhere to turn, are you advocating that someone could technically read the Pathfinders and then read The Simple Path to Wealth, because they will be motivated by the Pathfinders book, and then they will want to seek out the original book that you wrote?
Yeah, I think so, because I think for a lot of people, when they're first introduced to this idea of financial independence, it probably feels intimidating and maybe even unattainable. And there's a lot of the pushback I've heard over the years. They're like, well, that sounds great, but that's just for high income individuals that are just in this certain category. And That was never my experience as I met people in the financial community, and it's certainly not what you find in Pathfinders. You do find some of the 100 stories fit that profile, but a lot of the people doing this come from remarkably humble beginnings and have achieved incredible things. And so I like to say, you can, if you read Pathfinders, you will never again be able to look in the mirror and honestly say it can't be done, because you will have just read too many stories of people who've done it, and probably starting from more challenging positions than you have. Now, you could, of course, still say, I choose not to do it, but at least you will know that it's a choice available to you, that it's a path that you could, if you chose to, walk. And at least for my take, it would make walking it makes your life far better, far more expansive, far more opportunities, far freer.
Hey, that's a good point. And I really like how you speak about humble beginnings. You could become financially independent, debt free, and wealthy through humble beginnings. So there's a study, there have been studies done that have shown that teachers are in the top 2 to 3 of millionaires. And a lot of teachers that I meet just don't believe it. They don't believe that these studies that have been done with 10 to 20,000 people are actually correct. But if you think about it, you look at doctors and lawyers, a lot of time they're notoriously bad with money. And whereas teachers, they have to be really good with attention to detail. So if you make a decent amount of money, you have a little bit of extra money to invest after all of the basic needs are met, then yeah, you can definitely build wealth. And that's one thing that my wife and I have done, being two educators. The good thing is that we have money that's automatically taken off the top for our state pension. So that is building your net worth every month. But then at the same time, we have these other opportunities for investing as well, like 403B. Then we do our own individual Roth IRAs and an HSA as well. So, but that comes from attention to detail. If you have to write a lesson plan, you can write a budget. So yeah, a lot of time, with doctors, they aren't necessarily, good with paperwork.
I think people confuse income with wealth, right? And so the key is not how much you make, because I've known a lot of people who've made a lot of money, incomes of $1 million+ who will never be financially independent because they've created lifestyles around that money that absorb all of it and then some. So it's not how much you make, it's how much you keep, right? It's how much you pay yourself, that you spend on building your own wealth. And if you're not, no matter how much you make, if you're not doing that, you're never going to be wealthy. You will always have a high income. You might have a high income, but that won't translate into wealth because it'll be frittered away on other stuff. So it's a balance, right? Being financially independent is not having a set amount of money. It's how much do you need versus how much do you have in investable assets. It's that ratio. And if you take what you need multiplied by 25, you have roughly the amount of money you need invested in order to support that lifestyle and therefore be financially independent.
Yeah, you really make good points. And what it really makes me think of is the phrase lifestyle creep.
Yeah.
Or the term lifestyle creep. And for those who don't know, it's basically, let's suppose you're making $50,000 a year. And, unfortunately in our society, people who make $50,000 a year, a lot of time they might live on $60,000 a year. Because remember, right. They might live on $60,000 a year. But then when they get a raise to $60,000 a year, instead of realizing, hey, I make enough for my basic expenses, I make enough to cover my obligations. No, now they start living on $70,000 or $80,000 a year, and it's never enough. Which is why, whether it's an athlete making $5 million or $10 million a year, when they sign a new contract, they are now going to obtain things that are going to put them in more debt. More they start getting more liabilities
Right.
and they're never able to catch up. So, I was watching another podcaster a few weeks back, and he had a really good video, and he was just talking about he's big in the scammer space, exposing scammers and people who stolen money from banks and those kind of things. And was just talking about how this lady was making $300,000 a year, but that wasn't even enough, and it got to the point where she had to steal $4 million from Facebook. Yeah, and she got caught doing that, and she's actually now losing out on a job where she was making, in the mid six figures, and she's going to be a convicted felon when all you had to do was just lower your cost of living, which
Yeah.
is incredible.
Well, you just took the words out of my mouth. It is kind of incredible, and talk about ruining your life. I mean, you've created a life where you have something that is of enough value that someone's willing to pay you $300,000 a year to do it. That's pretty impressive achievement. But because you can't control your spending, or you haven't, you get lured into doing something illegal, dishonest, embezzling, stealing money, and the next thing you know, you've lost everything. I mean, that's hard to take, but I don't think that's all that an uncommon story. When I got out of college, and it took me 2 years to get my first professional job, and it paid $10,000 a year. And that's probably, I don't know, adjusted for inflation, because that was back in the 70s, maybe 50,000 a year now. But I could look around, and I knew that there were people living on $5,000 a year, and there was no reason I couldn't do that. And $5,000 a year was a whole lot more than I had been living on while I was in college. So that was a big jump up in lifestyle right there. And that freed up the other 5,000 to begin buying my freedom by buying investable assets. And then when my income rose and I was making 20,000 a year, well, now I was living on twice as much, from 5 to 10, and I was still investing twice as much. And so my lifestyle inflated, but at a very controlled pace. And at the same time, my investable assets were inflating and growing. So people sometimes say to me, how can you possibly save 50% of your income? Well, when you start that way, it's not hard at all. And then of course, I have other people in the FI community who push back and say, 50%, that's nothing. I'm saving 60, 70, 80%. So, it all depends on perspective, but it's perfectly doable.
So the bottom line is that the more you can invest in the early on, is the quicker you can become financially independent. And as you start to get used to the smaller amount of income that you're living on, then it's really no big deal. It's easier to fire, as they say, financially independent,
Yep.
retire early.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So, as we talked about with Pathfinders, Pathfinders is really comprised of 9 topics, which freedom, debt, saving, lifestyle, inflation, investing, FU money, which is my favorite, staying the course, family, and end game.
Yeah.
If you want to elaborate or start with any of those, are any of those topics more important than others?
Well, I think they're all equally important. And maybe the interesting thing is how we chose those nine particular sections. And when I say we, I'm referring to my editor, Chris, over at Harriman House, my publisher. And it was really our contributors who sort of self-organized that, if you will, because I put out a call asking for people to share their stories, because I'd been hearing these stories for years, but I hadn't collected them. And, of course, initially, I had no idea if we'd get enough response for the book. We got more than enough response. It was very gratifying, and we got all these cool stories. And then it became a challenge of going through them and picking out the 100 best. And they also, they were, the nature of the stories is what defined those categories. So there's, okay, here's some stories about people who dealt with debt. Here's stories of people who dealt with lifestyle inflation. Here's stories of people dealing with the issues around family and doing this. Here's some stories of people who are at the finish line, who are now financially independent, what we call endgame. The stories around why to do it, which are the stories in the freedom section. So I think they're all, I mean, all the sections, it's like asking me which is my favorite child, right? They're all, and some of the stories could have fit in more than one section. So we had fun deciding, okay, where exactly does this go? And then the other reason, by the way, that I think Pathfinders is kind of a good introduction to the whole idea is at the beginning of each of these sections, I talk about the section and some of the principles behind walking the simple path to wealth that are discussed in that. And so you do get an introduction to the simple path to wealth when you're reading Pathfinders. So yeah, I think it's a great book to introduce the whole concept of walking the path walking the simple path to wealth, which leads you to financial independence.
Yeah, those are good points. And I really do like how at the beginning of each topic you lay things out. You give your particular spiel on that topic, and then you just lay it out and set it up for that chapter. So I think it's really really done well. And anybody who reads the book who doesn't necessarily have a concept of the financial independence movement, I think that they'll really come out with open ears and open eyes. And you've laid out the plan to where if you don't know anything after that book, you should know quite a bit, and you'll have a game plan on how you can move forward in with your financial situation.
I think one of the most tragic things in our culture is that so many people don't even realize that this is a possibility. They don't even know that this option exists. And so if someone reads Pathfinders or The Simple Path to Wealth for that matter, they may not choose to do this. They may say, well, okay, that's nice, but I still want to keep, buying my luxury cars or whatever it is that's more important to them. But at least now they know that it's an option. Now they know that this is a choice that's available to them. And so it's not, you and I, it's not our obligation to determine what anybody else does with their life or their money. Nor would I want that obligation. But I think if all I've accomplished is making people aware that this option exists and that it is available to them, that it's not available only to some elite group that they might not belong to, then okay, now they can decide. It amazes me that people would decide to do anything other than be financially free, but that's me, because I just can't think of anything I'd rather spend my money on than my freedom. But I guess that's me.
Hey, and I love how you laid that out. I think that every dollar you spend, it is a sacrifice to freedom. It's a trade-off. If you spend $1 today on a latte or $1 on a trip, there's $1 you're taking away from your freedom. But at the same time, you need to be able to balance things out. So I really share your book in a lot of groups. I've even shared the information with you. If somebody is struggling with money and they need a book, they need an idea. I just sent the other day, I posted our first video in one of these financial groups, or I'll post your book and I say, hey, if you just need to start somewhere, start here, Simple Path to Wealth. And the other day I shared Pathfinders with someone. But at the same time, I think that there are other books that really are companions to your book. Like they go very well with your book. And one of them is The Psychology of Money. We need to understand why we are overspending. And I don't know if you've read Die with Zero yet. That's another phenomenal book
I
to
have, yeah.
you have. Okay. And so one thing that's done with me is that it has allowed me to really balance the whole concept of FU money and freedom with also living for today, because I was throwing all this money into retirement. So imagine me dying and my kids are 70 years old and I give them this large inheritance. Well, what are they going to do? They're not going to go, climbing mountains or anything like that at 70.
Right.
So why not spend some of that money now, go on cruises, go on trips? I've scheduled 4 cruises in the next year and a half. So, and that really has a lot to do with just, looking at various points of view, but there's nothing wrong with people who want to just continue to stack their money so that they can become financially independent a little sooner.
So first of all, I would say Psychology of Money is a great book. It's one of my favorites, and I think it's an ideal companion to Simple Path to Wealth, and now, frankly, Pathfinders. Die with Zero to me is a very interesting book, and I think what you're alluding to is he makes a great point. If you think about the age gap in generations, if you're going to leave an inheritance to your children and you live to a ripe old age of 90, well, your children are going to be in their 60s and maybe 70s or pushing 70. And, they will have hopefully already established themselves. They don't really need your money at that point. Now, maybe you can leave it to your grandchildren, and that's a possibility. But he makes the case of, start giving the money away when everybody's younger, including you. And, that's maybe when they can best use it. And you get to, and you're alive to see them enjoy it, right? So that makes perfect sense. My concern about that book is that I think it's an important book for you to have read, and it's an important book for someone like me to have read. But most Americans don't seem to have any problem. They don't need any encouragement to spend their money now. I think most Americans need encouragement to actually start building their wealth. And that's what concerns me about it a little bit, is that, people like us are unicorns, right? So the kind of people who can read that book and really benefit from it are a fairly small, I think, sliver of the population. I think for a very large part of the population, it might encourage and enable bad behavior that already exists, that, this YOLO, fear of missing out and spend every dime you have because you might die tomorrow kind of thing. So that's my concern about the book. But for people like us, if you're solidly on the simple path to wealth and you're a diligent saver and investor, then yeah, Die with Zero is probably a nice counterbalance to that worldview that you ought to read. If you're spending every nickel you get and borrowing to spend more, then yeah, that's not a book that's going to be helpful to you.
Well, no, I agree with you 100%. I like the way that you put it.
Yeah.
People who can benefit from the book are people who are on the path to, financial freedom. I agree with you 100%. If you are still drowning in debt, you shouldn't even be thinking about leaving money for your kids yet, because you don't have anything to leave your kids. So that's a really good point there that you mentioned. So yeah, that's a good counterbalance. I think, as you say, that's a good counterbalance.
Yeah, he tells a story in that book of, I think it's a friend of his, if I recall correctly, who, I want to say, borrowed $10,000 or something from a loan shark in order to go take a trip to Europe. And and of course he's presenting this as a something we all ought to emulate, and I think that's the very definition of insanity as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
But so there you go.
So yeah, I agree. So it's definitely not a book that I would hand to someone who is trying to get out of debt or someone who is just being introduced to financial literacy. and even with me, my wife and I think can be a little more free now, knowing that, hey, we have all of this VTSAX over here, but then we have the guaranteed pension, which will serve as the bond portion of our retirement. So we will always have that pension to where instead of just building all this money up over here in these individual retirement accounts, we can spend a little bit and enjoy our money now. So that's not going to be the same for everybody.
Yeah, and it is, things are different for different people at different stages of your life. But one of the things about following the simple path to wealth is it does make you wealthy. And you are going to find yourself in a situation where your money is throwing off maybe more money than you can spend. And the tools you use to get to that position, which is monitoring your money very carefully, saving and investing, might not be the same tools that you need to enjoy it. And I was you probably know who Mr. Money Mustache is. He's got a wonderful blog.
Yeah, Pete.
Pete, he's also a very interesting man and a great guy, and he and I were at Chautauqua together a number of years ago, and we were in Ecuador, and we were walking into town to buy a couple bottles of wine at a local bodega. And as we're walking to town, and he'd been there before and I hadn't, and as we're approaching the store, I said to him, so how much does wine cost in this place? And he turned to me and said, it's free. And I said, Pete, I know things are inexpensive in Ecuador, but it's not free. The shopkeeper is going to expect us to give him some money before we walk out of his store with the wine. So how much is, he said, no, you misunderstand me entirely. He said, JL, for you and me, everything's free. And I said, what are you talking about? And he said, well, when you achieve a certain level of wealth and your money is throwing off a certain amount of money, then essentially everything's free. And that was an epiphany for me, because it was very liberating, because I had, every spending decision I'd made in my life, I'd made very, very carefully. But now I was at a stage in my life where I didn't really need to do that anymore, because essentially whatever I spent, and to be clear, if I was out buying airplanes and yachts and islands, this wouldn't be true. But for the lifestyle I lead, which is fairly modest, whatever I buy on a menu, whatever restaurant I go to, whatever shirt I buy or what have you, it just doesn't matter, because my investment portfolio is providing more than enough money to cover all of that and then continue to grow on its own. So that's what he meant. And my wife has also been a very careful spender, and this has kind of become a mantra for us, and also a running joke when we're shopping for something, and we'll look at it and say, should we buy this? And what, okay, that seems kind of expensive, and she'll turn to me or I'll turn to her and say, it doesn't matter, everything's free. and that's a wonderful position to be in, and that's what buying your freedom leads to.
Wow. So if you take the free out of freedom, and then you think about financial independence, if you have done it correctly, the things that you buy really are free, because it's coming from interest that you earn throughout the years. It's coming from dividends.
Yeah. There's a book called, that I like, that was written probably 100 years ago, called The Richest Man in Babylon. It's a very thin, very short book. And it's, my hesitation in recommending it is that it's such a simple read. It might be easy to miss how profound the lessons in it are, but it's told as a parable, as a story, and it takes place in ancient Babylon, and these guys get together and they're having coffee, and they're kind of lamenting the fact that there's never enough money at the end of the week to cover everything that they need to expend. And one of them says, Akbar, he's the richest man in Babylon. Why don't we go talk to him and see how he did it? And so they do. And then the book is Akbar's lessons on how to do it. And he talks at one point about having your purse overflowing with gold to such an extent that no matter how much gold you spend out of your purse, it keeps producing and more gold. And that's kind of the concept that I'm talking about. That's what your investments do for you. And that's, of course, what he meant by his purse with gold. His investments were kept filling his purse at a more rapid rate than he could spend it. And so you become wealthier and wealthier. And that's part of that's how I discovered I was financially independent. I was doing a review of our year-end finances, and during my corporate life, I used to take sabbaticals once in a while where I wasn't working and earning any income, and this was during one of those. And my wife had also quit her job, and she'd gone back to school, and our daughter was born, and so we had no income, and we had this extra expense with the child, and I'm totaling everything up at the end of the year. And I noticed something remarkable, and that was that we'd paid all our bills. We were living pretty much the same lifestyle we'd lived when we had income. And at the end of the year, I had more money than I started with. And I thought, that's kind of interesting. I wasn't smart enough to put two and two together that this meant that because I didn't have any concept of financial independence in those days. This would have been back in the early 90s. So financial independence was not a term I'd ever heard at that point. And then I looked, I said, well, I'm going to look at the year before. And it was the same thing that happened the year before. And I looked at the year before that and the same thing. And I just somehow hadn't even noticed. But that's what financial independence is when your investments are building your wealth faster than you're spending.
That makes a lot of sense. So I quite often see individuals in some of these social media groups, such as Facebook, and they'll say, hey, I think we reached financial independence. And they'll show how 30 years ago, their account had $1 million in there. And then they'll go through all of the down years. And then they will talk about how much they've spent throughout the years and, any other negative occurrences that they've had in their lives. But then they'll show that now their balance is $3.8 million. After all of these bad things and after all the trips they've been on, they still have way more than they had at the beginning. So yeah, it makes a lot of sense what you're saying right now. They probably, if they review all of their previous years, they'll see that, hey, we're financially independent, but some people just don't pay attention to it,
Yeah, that's absolutely true. That's the thing when you look at the Trinity study, which is one of the supporting studies behind the idea of 4% withdrawal rate, right? Well, the Trinity study looked at lots of different withdrawal rates, and you just take 4%, which was, I guess somebody identified that as the sweet spot. And if you withdraw 4% a year, adjusted for inflation, with at least a 50% stock allocation, right? So between stocks and bonds, at least 50%, because if you don't have enough stocks, you don't have enough growth. But anyway, if you do that, the Trinity study suggests that your money is going to last at least 30 years. And that's true 96% of the time. It only fails to last 30 years 4% of the time. Well, that's all well and good, but what you only see if you look at the charts in more detail is that not only does it last that 96% of the time, but most of the time it grows to incredible proportions if you're only pulling 4%, right? So that's kind of the power of growth is amazing, and the power of compounding is amazing.
So that kind of leads into my next question. One of our favorite finance guys, finance gurus, so to speak, he thought the 4% rule was ridiculous. He said at least 8% can be pulled out. He's assuming He's assuming 12% return every year. I mean,
Yeah.
I know you've probably gotten a lot of questions about it, but what's your take on the assumption that 8% is a safe withdrawal rate?
Well, I think, and I know who you're talking about, and you're careful not to mention the name, and he's come under a lot of criticism for that, and I think justifiably so. So, the contention is that you can reliably make 12% a year, and therefore 8% is you can withdraw it, and you got another 4% that's building, and you just can't count on making 12% a year unless you're taking some really inordinate risks. Um, so again, I turned to the Trinity study. I don't have it in front of me, but you could actually go to that study and you could see how often an 8% withdrawal rate works based on that study. And it works some of the time, and my memory isn't great, but I want to say it probably works like 58% of the time or something. But of course, that means that almost half the time it's going to fail the last 30%. So my take is, and then of course there are a lot of people who say 4% is way too aggressive. It should be 3.2% or something. I think 4% is a great guideline. I think 4% is a great starting point. If you need $40,000 a year and you have $1 million invested, 40,000 is 4% of that million. I think you can consider yourself pretty comfortably financially independent. By the way, that goes back, if you take that 40,000 and you multiply it by 25, you're going to get $1 million. So I think that's a great guideline, but you're going to want to have to pay attention because, as I said a moment ago, 4% of the time that withdrawal rate fails. So you don't want to run out of money. But the other reason you want to pay attention is that the vast majority of time, 4% is in fact very conservative. And your money will grow to pretty large proportions. Well, you want to be able to enjoy that money. You don't want to just let it grow until you die, or at least I don't think most people do. So you pay attention and adjust as you go along. And if suddenly you happen to retire just at the beginning of a major market decline that drags on for years, then yeah, you're probably going to want to pull back from that 4%. On the other hand, if you retire at the beginning of a major market increase, you've got the wind at your back, well, then you might want to loosen up and spend a little more money. But 4% is a good guideline. I would never start taking 8% and just forget about it.
Yeah, when I heard that, of course, I thought it was absolutely insane. But I wasn't the only one. I was like, am I the crazy guy here? But no, I started seeing all of these other creators talking about it. So going back to the Pathfinders book, I'm of the belief that there are two concepts that you really need to understand in order to become financially independent. And of course, one is one of your 9 topics, which is lifestyle inflation. I also think it's extremely important to understand the concept of hedonic adaptation.
Mm.
Yeah, so when you're having these conversations with people for the book and you're talking about lifestyle inflation, people who understand that it's important to avoid lifestyle creep, how many people actually that you can recall mentioned hedonic adaptation, the hedonic treadmill? Do you recall many people?
Well, I can't recall how many, but one story in particular leaps to mind, and I think it's in the lifestyle inflation section, but I'm not entirely sure. But anyway, it's the story of this guy who's a police officer, and he talks about how when he first starts his career, his beat is a very specific part of the city, right? And so when he's on duty, he can only stay in that part of the city. And as it happens, his favorite burrito place is outside of his beat. So the only time he gets to go to his favorite burrito place is once a week when he's off duty. He can go over and have his favorite burrito. Well, he gets promoted to be detective. And once he's a detective, his work takes him all over the city. He can go anywhere in the city at all, well, including the part of the city where his favorite burrito place is. So now suddenly he manages to get over to have his favorite burrito for lunch most days. And now instead of having it once a week, he's having it, I don't know, 4 or 5, maybe 6 times a week. And he comes to the conclusion, after a while, it just wasn't as special anymore. It just wasn't as good because I was just getting it too often. It was better when I can only have it once a week. And that's what you're talking about. That's that phenomena. And I think it's important to understand because, people tend to think, because we're taught to think that, oh, if I only had a better car, my life would be, or a bigger house or my favorite burrito every day instead of once a day, then my life would be better. And for the most part, those things disappoint. You get that initial, when you first start having your favorite burrito every day, it's like, that's pretty cool. It's like when you first get that fancy car, it's like, this is pretty cool. But pretty soon it's just a car. And pretty soon it's just lunch. It's not special anymore. And I think that's an important thing to bear in mind. Whereas if you're building your wealth, it's always special.
Such a great story and a great point. I remember a few years back, we bought our house in 2015. They four bedrooms, 3 bath. Kids are smaller at that time. As they started getting bigger, we're like, man, I don't know if we have enough space in this house. So my wife and I would start looking at homes every week, but we knew that it would cost a considerable amount of money to upgrade the house. So I put a post out there and I just asked a question in one of these financial groups. And the guy said, hey, look up the hedonic treadmill. So I looked it up and that's when I was like, hey, you know what? Is it worth 360 extra payments or 180 extra payments to only realize 3 or 4 months of happiness and joy?
Yeah.
And once I start realizing that concept, it really, took things over. Like I was like, hey, I can drive the same car for forever because ultimately the purpose is really just to get you where you need to go. So that new car smell is not worth the 72 months, 84, or even 96 months of payments that we have, JL. I don't know if you've seen 96-month car payments.
I've heard of them. I've never had a car payment myself.
Yeah.
So that just seems insane. But my dad, and when speaking of cars, and this is what I learned from him, he used his car in business and he'd buy a new car every 5 years and he always paid cash. And once he bought that new car, he would start building the savings account for the next new car. So he was making car payments, but to himself. So instead of him sending the money to the bank and paying the bank interest, he was putting the money in the bank and the bank was paying him interest. And then at the end of 5 years, he'd have enough for the next car. And that just seemed to me to make an enormous amount of sense. And all it takes is being willing to drive junky cars for a while in the beginning, until you get that first amount of money saved up for the car, if you think you even need a new car.
And that's a great point. The average car payment now is almost enough to fund 2 Roth IRAs.
Yeah.
It's insane. It's ridiculous. And a lot of times you have these conversations with people and you say, oh, I can't afford it. And not to judge, but that if this individual drove a cheaper car or lived in a less expensive house, that they would be able to pay themselves first rather than, because it's the same money. If you have $2,000 a month after your obligations, or you could have $2,000 a month and you're spending $1,000 a month on a car payment, you could be spending $1,000 a month on yourself, like you said,
Yeah. So I think it's, I've started framing it as it's just a different way of spending your money, right? Because I think I always used to frame it, and I think most people do is if I'm saving my money and investing my money, that's money I can't spend, right? But I've come to start saying, the truth is I've spent every dime that's ever come into my hands. And I've spent them almost the moment I got them. The difference is that I spent half those dimes on buying the single thing that was most important to me, and that was my freedom. So everybody makes decisions on what they're going to buy and how they're going to spend their money. They just don't realize that one of the options for spending their money is buying their freedom, which of course you do by buying financial assets. They just don't think that way, which is going back to what I said earlier in our conversation. I hope that if you read Pathfinders and or The Simple Path to Wealth, you will realize that one of the things, of the many things you can spend your money on, one of the things you can buy is your financial freedom, which not only makes you free, but then gets you to that point where your purse will continue to overflow even as you spend money. I think I think if most people understood that, just like when they're deciding, do I want to buy a Cadillac or do I want to buy a Chevrolet? If I buy the Cadillac, I get to drive the fancy car. If I buy the Chevrolet, it's not such a fancy car, but then I got a bunch of other money that I could spend on other stuff, right? So that's the thought process that goes through. So just realize this is just one other thing you could consider spending your money on. And I think when you realize the incredible benefits you get spending your money this way, that to me, it's a no-brainer. But I understand why most people don't even think of it as an option.
Yeah, you're right. So every dime that comes in, you're going to spend it one way or another.
Right.
Spend it on yourself, which would mean you're spending it on your financial freedom later on. That's a good way to put it. You mentioned cars, and I was listening to an interview that Morgan Housel did. And for those that don't know, he is the author of The Psychology of Money. And one thing that he brought up that made a lot of sense was when people are driving around in these fancy cars, you might see somebody at a red light for a few seconds, but they're not looking at you. They're not thinking about how cool you are. They're thinking about how cool they would be if they were in your car. And just think, like, if people who go out there to impress others with materials or with these fancy cars, if they knew, like, hey, I don't look cool in this car because nobody even notices me driving the car. Think about how much that could change our financial situations. I don't know. What do you think?
Oh, I absolutely agree with that. And I love that analogy. And I'd take it even a step further. Most people, if they look at somebody in a fancy car, they're like, look at that tool. Look at that, look at that jerk. But boy, wouldn't I look cool in that car? But you're right. It's nobody, if you're driving around in your fancy car, nobody's looking saying, wow, look at that cool guy. I mean, nobody,
Nobody.
they're all either looking and saying, what a tool, and maybe in addition to, they're saying, but I'd look cool in that car,
Absolutely.
They're not thinking about you. So if you're out to impress the world, you're probably not getting much traction there.
Yeah, and I remember a story of a guy who, he had this special order Porsche. I think it was on hold for like 5 months, and the dealership finally called him, and he stalled for a few weeks, and finally his wife said, "You've been wanting this car for a long time. Go get the car." So he went and he got the car, but he only drove it a few times because he was actually embarrassed to drive that car, So he ended up selling the car. So,
well, and then you also, at least I would worry about it, right? So, you take your $150,000 Porsche and it gets a ding in it in the parking lot, that's going to be, at least for me, a very bad day,
An awful day.
An awful day. An awful day.
I can't. It's funny you bring that up. I can't tell you how many dents and scratches we have I got 16 Camry out there, and my wife has a 16 Odyssey, and like they have scratches. They have hell damage. I couldn't care in the least,
I have a great story around that. Back when I lived in New Hampshire, I was friends with my doctor. And he and I were out to lunch one day, and we came out of the restaurant, and he said, we talk about this kind of stuff. And he said, hey, I take a little walk for me down the street here. I want to show you my car. And I'd never seen his car before. And so I said, sure. And I'm thinking he probably bought himself a new Beamer or Mercedes or something, and he wanted to show it off. Well, we get down to his car, and it was a Honda CRV, a little SUV. It's about 10 years old. Not a single square inch of it was unscratched. I mean, it was just covered with little dents and little scratches, and he's very proudly showing me this. And he said, here's what I really want to show you is this. And we go to the back end of the car, and there's this fairly large dent in the rear of his car. He said, he said, about 3 months ago, I was parked somewhere, and this guy backed into me, and he put that dent in. Right. And he got out of his car, and he was so upset, and he was so apologetic. He said, oh man, I didn't see you there. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to hit you. Let me give you my insurance information, and I'll get it fixed and everything. And Dan, my doc buddy, said he went over, he looked at it. He said, nah, forget it. This guy was, what do you mean, forget it? I bashed in your car. And I'm like, yeah, this is why I drive a car like this. Don't worry about that.
Great point, man. That's an incredible story, incredible story. Just doesn't matter. It gets him where he needs to go.
Doesn't matter. Yeah. So now when I see banged up cars, I look around and I wonder just how rich is that guy?
But so somebody like you and I, we can have that thought to where a lot of people in our modern day society, they'll probably think how broke that guy is.
Well, and to be clear, I'm sure there are some broke people who are driving cheap cars for that reason. When I was young and broke, that was me. But on the other hand, I mean, I think unfortunately there are a lot of fairly poor people, low income people, who are driving fancy cars because their ego drives them to do it. They've been taught that's what they need to present as if they're wealthy. And of course, a lot of wealthy people don't do that. In fact, the book, The Millionaire Next Door, very famously talks about the kinds of cars actual millionaires drive, American millionaires. And they're not driving Ferraris and Porsches. And I mean, some are, but most of them are driving very ordinary, typically American cars. Warren Buffett, he does drive a Cadillac, but he keeps them he's famous as saying, I keep my car until my daughter tells me it's too embarrassing and I really have to get rid of it. And of course, Warren Buffett could certainly afford to buy any car he wanted. So a Cadillac is pocket change for him. But he was asked, well, why don't you just buy a new car more often? He said, because it would take me half a day to buy a car. To go to the dealership and buy a car takes half a day. He said, that's not how I want to spend half of any of my days. That's just, and I think that's true. It's, buying cars is a pretty miserable experience by and large. It's not how I want to spend half my day either.
Yeah, it's definitely a miserable experience. However, I would tell Mr. Buffett, hey, it's a lot easier than it was probably when he first started buying cars. You can buy a car in about an hour. You can do everything online now. So if I had his money, maybe I would, buy a car every few years. I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah, who knows?
Maybe I'll get there one day. So I think that a lot of the time when we look at this financial independence movement, a lot of people who are trying to get started, they have absolutely no idea where to start with investing, because no matter how well you do with money, if you are debt free, if you make $200,000 a year and you're putting your money in a savings account, you will never become financially independent. I guess you can become financially independent, but it will just take a lot longer. So I always just tell people, whether you're a 0 or a 10 as far as your knowledge of investing, I think a great place to start would be a total stock market index fund such as VTSAX. Can you kind of elaborate and tell the audience how that fits in with the Pathfinders path to wealth?
Right. So VTSAX that's the fund that I personally invest in. That's the fund that I have my daughter investing in. As you said, it's Vanguard's total stock market index fund. And what that means is that it owns virtually every publicly traded company in the United States. And that total number will vary. The last time I looked, it's about 4,000 different companies. And so when you buy VTSAX, in a very real sense, you own a very small, but you own a piece of every one of those companies. And that means that everybody in those companies, from the CEO to the factory floor, is working to make you richer. Now, some of those companies will do well and prosper. Some of them will fail. And those that fail will drift off the index. Those that prosper will actually become a bigger and bigger part of VTSAX, because the proportion that VTSAX buys of each company is cap weighted, which simply means the bigger the company, the bigger the percentage of the portfolio is represented by it. So that's one of the advantages. This is a process I call self-cleansing. So the winners rise to the top, the losers fall away. The losers, and of course, they'll fall off the index before they lose 100%, but that's the most they can lose. Whereas the winners can gain 100% or 200 or 500 or 10,000, right? There's almost no limit to how far they can go. And then because every company has a life cycle, right? Those winners will eventually begin to lose their luster and drift away. I don't have to worry about when that happens or even if it happens, because they'll just drift down and they'll be replaced by whatever comes next. So a great example, if you look at that, is Sears, which maybe a lot of our younger listeners are barely aware of what Sears is, but Sears Roebuck was the Amazon of its day 100 plus years ago. They pioneered mailing things out to rural America that those people could never buy before because they didn't have access to stores. Sears dominated retail for 100 years. I mean, they were the biggest gorilla you could imagine. Now they're an afterthought. They were taken over by Walmart and then by Amazon, and so Sears has drifted down the index and Walmart and Amazon have grown up. Jeff Bezos has said that he knows at some point Amazon's gonna drift away. Somebody's gonna figure out how to do it better and be more appealing to customers. He knows that because he knows that's the nature of business. He said, my job, of course, he's stepped away from being CEO, but back when he was CEO, he said, my job is to try to prevent that as long as possible, to keep us as sharp and on top of the game as long. But that's the natural progression. But when you own VTSAX, you own all of those companies, and that's self-cleansing. And so you will always own the best performers, and the other performers will drift away. While we're talking about this, the other criticism, by the way, of VTSAX is that, well, because it's cap weighted, it's really just a technology fund, because all the biggest companies these days are technology companies, right? And that's the bulk of VTSAX are in these technology companies. Well, that's a feature, not a bug. One of the few advantages of being an old guy is that I can remember when those top companies were financial companies, when they were consumer products companies. The companies that occupy that top tier of VTSAX are not the same, and they rotate out. I don't know when technology will rotate out of the top spot or what will replace it. But again, I don't care. I don't have to, because whatever it is, I will own it. And at the same time, I will own technology in a large doses as long as they are the dominant companies, right? So that's the beautiful thing. The other comment I'll make about is about savings, because you mentioned, it's extremely difficult to achieve financial independence with just a savings account. And the problem with it is that your rate of return, the interest rate you are paid, is always going to trail inflation. And so, right now, interest rates are high. And so people that are in money market funds or have their money in savings accounts are getting a better return than they have for decades. But interest rates are high because inflation has been high. And so your money in a savings account is always going to be slowly eroded to inflation. So the spending power of it is going to reduce over time, even though the dollar amount might look the same. So that's why you need stocks, because stocks are an engine of growth.
That's a great breakdown of VTSAX and why you should be invested in an index fund. You mentioned about 3,900 stocks that VTSAX is made of, and that goes back to when you mentioned self-cleansing. Maybe about a year and a half ago, I looked at VTSAX and they had about 4,150 stocks at the time.
Okay.
So clearly there was about 250 that have fallen off the index, or even more, and then maybe some more have entered the index. Like you said, you own such a small percentage of those stocks at the bottom of the index, and you don't even notice when they fall off.
Right. It's a vibrant living thing, right? So as long as the US remains a capitalist country with a viable stock market, and companies are encouraged to grow and thrive, and competition is a thing, the country itself will do well. And investing in the country by virtue of investing in every publicly traded company, you're gonna prosper. You're gonna do very well.
Absolutely. And I think it's very important to emphasize the importance of staying the course. Stay the course. I have a friend who, right in the middle of the pandemic, I remember seeing a Facebook post, and she was concerned about her money, about her investments. And I said, hey, don't do anything. And if you tell people, hey, buy more, it's on sale, well, that still kind of is timing the market, because if you buy it today because it's dropped from a week ago, well, it could drop some more. So I always tell people to just stay the course, buy when you can. Don't try to figure out if it's going to go lower or higher. Just buy when you can get in, and then hold as long as you can. But she sold, and then about a week and a half later, the market was back where it was when she sold, or it was back to where it was before she sold. It was almost, I don't know if you remember, I think VTSX was down from like 101 to like $58, but it was back up quickly.
Yeah, it was kind of an amazing time, because I think that it plunged pretty dramatically because of COVID, but I think it also set a record in recovery, right? I think it was within a month that the market went from this steep. If you look at the chart, it's like this steep drop and then this vertical rise back again, which is very unusual. But I remember at the time, because I'm very much a stay the course guy. And I tell people all the time, the market is volatile. That's dealing with and living with that volatility is the price we have to pay to get the long-term growth out of the market that it will provide over the decades. And that volatility is a perfectly natural part of the process. So when the market corrects, which is a 10% drop, or there's a bear market, which is a 20% drop, or there's a crash like during COVID, These are all perfectly normal parts of the process. Nobody should ever be panicked by them, although they frequently are. Nobody should ever be surprised, although they frequently appear to be, especially in the media, which stokes the panic. You should have, hopefully, your investments on autopilot, where a certain amount of money out of your paycheck is going every month. You should absolutely leave that alone during drops. And you should appreciate the fact that you're now getting to buy these things on sale. You're getting more shares for your dollar than you were before the market dropped. And you should understand that it's not the end of the world. It's like hurricanes in Florida or blizzards in New England. They're scary. They can be dangerous, especially if you panic and run out in the middle of them, but they don't last forever. And it's just what you live with if you live in Florida or New England, right? And it's what we have to live with if we're invested in the stock market. And if anything, a drop in the market is a gift to somebody building their wealth, because now every dollar they put in, they are buying shares on sale. And so, you shouldn't be intimidated or scared or panicked by these things. If anything, you should celebrate them as you're building your wealth. That, oh no, wow, my money is going to go a little bit further. In fact, I've told young people that when you're beginning to build your wealth, the best thing that could happen to you is a major market crash and that prices stay down for a decade, because that's when you're investing. That's when you're buying. People talk about the lost decade between 2000 and 2010, which was a really bad decade for stocks. But what a great decade to be accumulating shares. I mean, my goodness, that would have been an ideal decade to be buying shares of VTSAX, right?
Absolutely. I agree with you 100%. So that leads me to my next question. I often hear people say that the stock market is overpriced right now. And how do you know it's not underpriced?
Well, you don't. I mean, and there's also this idea that there's going to be some good time to buy the market. There's going to be some time to buy when but it's in one sense, it's never a good time to buy, because there's always going to be problems. People are either going to be say, oh, it's too high, it's overpriced, or it's just dropped by 20% and is going to go further down, it's going to get cheaper. You're never going to turn on the news and hear some guy say, wow, everything's come together, now's the perfect time to buy. So in one sense, it's never the right time to buy. And of course, correlate that is it's always the right time to buy. You should always be investing. As I say, the right time to invest is when you have money to invest. That's because over time, the market goes up.
Over time, the market goes up. I agree with you. And, we were fortunate enough, out of the last, decade, there were 2 times when we were able to max out our Roth IRA on January 1st or January 2nd, of course, because the markets closed on the 1st. The first time we did it, it was a great, 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 great year. The second time we did it was, I believe, is it 2022 is when it was a bad year?
Yeah, that was a bad year.
Yeah, we put $6,500 in each on January 1st that year, and then it was just an awful year. But it didn't matter to me, because I knew that $6,500 that I put in on January 1st that year, when we retire, that it's going to be way more than the $6,500. So I'm not worried about how much it lost that year, because I didn't lose anything, because I didn't sell anything.
Right. Yeah, that's it. I mean, if you're going to invest, you have to be thinking about the long term. And you have to be able to tie yourself to the mast and ride out the volatility. And by the way, if you can't do that, and I think it's important that people really think about their own psychology. A good reason to read The Psychology of Money, by the way. If you can't do that, then you do not want to follow my simple path to wealth. You do not want to invest in stocks, because if you're going to panic and sell when the market goes down, then my approach is going to leave you bleeding at the side of the road. In my approach, it's essential that you not panic. it's essential that you stay the course and keep investing during those down times. In fact, whether or not the market makes you wealthy is almost entirely dependent on what you do when it drops. You know, when the market's going up, everybody makes money. That's easy. What you do when the market drops determines whether it makes you wealthy. And if you panic and sell, and then wait until the market's gone back up again to buy in, then you're never going to become wealthy. You shouldn't be in the market. Find something else, right?
That's important. It's very important to realize your thoughts about money. And they asked you this question. I'm pretty sure I haven't opened a new investment account for quite a while, but they asked you the question about your risk tolerance when you're opening these investment accounts. You know, you need to understand where you stand as far as how do you feel about a market drop. You know, if you're going to pull your money out because it went from 100,000 to 50,000, you really just gave yourself a $50,000 pay cut or loss in value. You didn't give it a chance. You weren't willing to wait until it went back up to 100,000 and more. So it's very important to realize where you are. If you're one of those people who are afraid, then it might be in your best interest to just go ahead and park your money in a money market account. So yeah, you make a lot of sense.
Yeah, I remember in 07, 08, when we had the big financial panic and the market got cut in half. I want to say Warren Buffett's portfolio was down something like $35 billion. And of course, Warren Buffett was not panicking and selling. You don't become Warren Buffett by panicking and selling when things, he was out there actively looking for opportunities. But I was running around irritating my friends by saying, I wish I was down $35 billion, right? And they're, now, what are you talking about? Well, because the implication is that you still have $35 billion, right? If you were cut in half. So to a certain extent, when the market plunges, the more you're down is an indication of the better off you are, right? If you're down $50,000, well, you know, you're not as well off as the guy who's down 35 billion, as you've got 50,000 left and he's got 35 billion left.
Hey, it's funny.
My perverse way of thinking.
No, that's not a perverse way of thinking. I think that's actually an interesting way of looking at things, because I can recall, like, so it's pretty cool when you log into your accounts and you see green. But I can recall one day I logged into my accounts. This was years ago. This is before we have the wealth we have now. I think we were down collectively across all of my accounts and my wife's accounts. I think we're down like $3,500 to $5,000 or something. I'm like, man, how awesome is it to have enough money to where your portfolio is down $5,000? You know, yeah. I mean, I thought it was pretty cool, you know, but I knew I would recover, so I was fine with it. But to be able to look at your situation and your accounts are down $5,000 means that you're in a good situation.
Yeah, exactly. And then, you know, because the corollary, of course, is then, you know, the time will come when it's up $5,000, you know, or it'll be down 10,000 or up 10,000. And at some point, if you keep doing this, you know, it'll be up or down by more than your annual salary. Right. And that's when you start getting to that point where everything's free, right? Yeah. Because when you look at your portfolio and you suddenly realize that, you know, in any given month, let's say, your portfolio can be up or down more than the cost of a new car. Well, now essentially you're at that point where that car is free, right?
That's a good point. You know, and it's really funny because as you were mentioning, I was thinking, like, the days I log into my accounts and I see blood all over the place. I'm supposed to feel bad about it, but I have 8 years till I can retire. I actually don't feel that bad. You know, of course, it's going to hurt my net worth column, but I know that as a dollar cost average in my 403B account, that I'm buying more shares. And I actually pay attention, like, of course, this year, for the most part, every month we automatically invest in our 403Bs. Of course, every month we were getting less shares as we purchased, but because the market was up, pretty much every month. But there have been times when in the past I would buy more shares because the market was down, and I was like, wow, that's pretty cool. So like, I agree with you. A perfect scenario is that, let's say VTSAX, I believe it's at 113 now. Perfect scenario is that it went to $25. Of course, that would mean that we're probably in shambles, but went to $25, and I could buy for $25 a share every month for the next 8 years. And then the day I retire, it goes up to 125.
Right.
That's
right.
the perfect scenario for me. But of course,
Yeah.
I know that's not going to happen. I can't predict it. So that's why I just tell everybody, just put in what you can when you can, and just and leave it alone.
But that's a good way to frame how to think about drops, right? Because I think, you're already at the point where they don't bother you. You're probably going to wind up at the point where you look forward to them. I look forward to them. I mean, they don't, it's a non-issue, because I know long-term the market's just going to keep marching up, and every share I buy today, even if I'm buying it at all-time highs, well, today's all-time high is going to be eclipsed by the all-time highs in the future. So,
Hey, that's awesome. So I want to, wrap up pretty soon. It's been phenomenal content as always. Every time I have the pleasure and opportunity to speak with you, I
well, I
always
love
get.
our conversations.
I do as well, and they can go forever, because I know that you're dropping great information that I'm going to share with my people. I'm thinking about these pathfinders, the individuals who are regular people, just like you and I.
Yeah.
For the most part, they're not extraordinary or anything like that. It made me think of a study that I saw recently, and it talks about 50% of people believe that $100,000 a year will make you rich, but then over 50% of people who make $100,000 a year are still living paycheck to paycheck. So where is the disconnect?
Well, again, that becomes, there's almost no limit to how much money people can spend, right? No matter what they're, I like to tell the story. This goes back to I want to say the early, maybe the mid 90s. I was in Chicago having lunch with a friend of mine who was in the financial business. And it was in December, just before Christmas. And he'd just gotten his annual bonus. And in that business, your annual bonus is a big part of your annual income. But his bonus was $800,000. And back in the early 90s, that was real money. And you know what we talked about at lunch? How he couldn't make ends meet. And that sounds absurd, I'm sure, to you. It sounds absurd to me as I'm saying it. Probably sounds absurd to the people listening to us. But when we sat together over lunch and he walked me through, the leased luxury cars, the multiple homes, the private schools, on down the line, the exotic vacations, he was right. It was not enough money for the lifestyle he'd put together. And so there's a guy making probably $1.2 million altogether for the year, who is never going to be financially independent unless he starts adjusting his lifestyle. By the same token, I've known people who've made very modest amounts of money. In fact, if you read Pathfinders, you can read about some of these people who do become financially independent. Because again, it's not how much you make, it's not some set amount of money out there. It's how much you have in relation to how much you spend.
How much you have in relation to how much you spend. So if you were to do a math equation, it would be on top how much money you make, your income minus your outgo, and that would be it. It really is that simple.
Yeah, I mean, the math is, whatever you need to live on per year times 25, that's the amount of invested assets you need. And then whatever amount of invested assets you have, you can take 4% of that, and that will give you that annual income. So again, if you need 40,000 a year, you multiply it by 25, that's $1 million. If you have $1 million, you take 4% of that a year, that's $40,000. So that's the mathematical formula. If you need $60,000 a year, then you need $1.5 million invested. I mean, it's pretty simple, pretty straightforward.
It really is.
And by the way, if those numbers sound intimidating to somebody who's at the very beginning, I would also emphasize that this is a journey. It's not a light switch. So if you're starting from ground zero, the moment you start investing and saving, it's like going to the gym. The moment you start going to the gym, you get a little bit stronger. You're not going to be bench pressing 300 pounds the next day, but you're going to be a little bit stronger than you were before. Same thing financially. Every step of the way on that journey, you become financially a little bit stronger until ultimately you are financially independent. But it's not like you don't have anything in between the time it takes you to go from zero to financial independence. And even if you never get to full financial independence, let's suppose, your goal is that $1 million and you don't get there. You only get to $500,000. Well, that's not bad. You're better off than if you hadn't started the journey. One of my favorite quotes is from a guy named Leo Burnett. And the quote is, if you reach for a star, you might not get one, but you won't come up with a handful of mud either.
That's a good point. It kind of leads me to a post I saw on Instagram the other day. Content creator said, hey, if you invest $100 a month, from now until you're 65, or from 20 to 65, you'll have like 1.3 million. And people were in the comments like, 1.3 million won't be anything in 30 years. I'm like, 1.3 million is better than $1,000, which a lot of people don't have at that age. I'm like, come on, are you serious?
Well, and the other thing is because they're referring to inflation. So, whatever the rate of inflation is, if you're investing that $100 in something like VTSAX, your rate of return will probably be even higher than that because it will be tracking inflation because stocks are a great inflation hedge. So you'll probably wind up with more than that $1 million.
Yeah.
Whatever it turns out to be, it will be better than if you had done nothing.
Absolutely, 100%. 100%. Hey, so when we talk about the book, I think one of the coolest parts of the book was at the end where, I guess I don't want to spoil it, but anybody who's paying attention will see that there's an interview with your daughter, who was the inspiration of Simple Path to Wealth, which is amazing. She kind of is like my kids, where she was tired of hearing about it all the time, and that's why you did the blog and the book. So if you just want to tell me about that experience.
Yeah,
that'd be amazing.
So first of all, it was kind of tough to get her to agree to do the interview. Christine Benz at Morningstar conducts it, and it's interesting for me to hear Jessica's perspective on all of this stuff. But I had managed, because I think this is so important, and if you get money right, your life is so much better, so much richer, so many more options that, obviously I wanted that for my kid. So I pushed it too hard and too soon, and I managed to turn her off to all things financial. And that's why I started writing the blog, was to archive this information. And then, of course, the blog grew into Chautauquas, and then, which are the annual events I used to do, where we take small groups of people out to some cool place in the world. And then, it grew into the Simple Path to Wealth and the How I Lost Money in Real Estate, and now Pathfinders, and all because my daughter wouldn't listen to me. And she likes to tease me now. She says, Dad, if I'd listened to you when I was young, there'd be no blog. There would have been no Chautauquas. There'd be no books. Rashad wouldn't want to interview you. No, then none of this would exist. And she's right. I owe it all to the little girl who wouldn't listen.
That's an awesome story. And it kind of leads me to this quote: money is unimportant as long as you have plenty of it. But if you only have barely enough for your needs, it will prey on your mind. The moment you don't have enough, it suddenly becomes extraordinarily important. At that point, few things matter more, J.L. Collins.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, if you have enough money, you don't really have to think about money all that much. If you're living paycheck to paycheck, you're probably thinking about money all the time, and in a very negative way. It's like, how do I make ends meet, until the next paycheck comes? I mean, that's got to be a very difficult way to live. So if you just get a few money things right, which hopefully in Pathfinders and Simple Path to Wealth, you can learn how to do, yeah, your life becomes a whole lot easier. And part of it is, you realize that all this stuff that maybe you've been taught you need to have, you don't really need to have. Don't buy stuff to impress people you don't really like, right?
I agree.
You
I
don't need
agree.
be the guy driving the dented car, and then you'll have a few select people like Rashad and myself looking over and saying, "Wonder how much that guy's worth."
Hey, we can probably tell Millionaire when we see him. That is what I want my superpower to be, to just be able to look at somebody and say, "Hey, I think that guy's a millionaire." He, one of my favorite content creators is Clark Howard. He wears $3, polos from Costco all the time. He makes fun of himself because he looks like he doesn't have money, So it's pretty cool. I mean, but hey, JL, it's been incredible. The book is Pathfinders. Guys, I just want to be completely transparent with you. It's nothing like being on this side. It's nothing like being able to schedule a family trip with your wife and your kids and not really having to worry about where you're going to get the money from, not having to put it on credit. If you want to put it on credit and get the points, but pay it off the next day, you can, but you're not going into debt for any of these trips or anything else. And I would love for JL to just give any closing words to anybody who may be seeing this for the first time.
Well, the thing is, you mentioned debt. I think, again, I'm horrified by the fact that in this country we accept debt as normal. It's not normal. It's like being covered with blood-sucking leeches, right? You should just scrape those little bloodsuckers off as fast as you can. And when you buy something on credit, essentially you're saying, oh, that costs. Let's say it's a car. That car costs $30,000. I don't want to pay $30,000. I want to pay much, much more than that. That's what you're doing when you're buying things on credit. So yeah, I mean, it's fine to use credit cards are like chainsaws, right? Incredibly powerful tools that are incredibly dangerous if you don't know how to use them. And the way you use a credit card is to get the points and the benefits, and you pay it off at the end of without fail at the end of each month. So you're never paying a dime of interest. If you fall in the trap of not paying it off every month and paying interest, that's when you've used that chainsaw to cut your leg off.
Hey, and you're absolutely right. And that's why I like my American Express card, because one thing it allows you to do, if I go, pay this bill, I can immediately pay the payment right away. It shows that I have a credit. So it almost works like a debit card, because I hate waiting until the payment clears to make a payment. I don't like to do it, So I just look at it like I'm getting a 2 to 3% discount on every purchase that I was going to make anyway, But you're right. If you are not disciplined with money, don't go anywhere near a credit card, because it's a bad habit that we get into. Then once we borrow on one thing, it's easy to borrow on other things. And I like what you said about the car. Is when you decide that you are going to borrow money for a car, you aren't paying $30,000 for a car. You're paying 35, 40, 50, $60,000 for that car. And some people even justify taking out a low interest loan and foregoing any particular upfront rebates. So if you have that cash and you're able to pay with cash, but then take a rebate, you're coming out a lot better than, giving up their rebate to finance a vehicle. So just, being able to pay cash is just such a powerful tool. I tell people all the time, the most powerful day of my financial journey was when we became black as far as our net worth. When we went from the red to the black, that was our most powerful day in finances. And kind of to go back to what you said earlier, every day after that was, has been positive ever since as far as our journey is concerned. And now we're at a place where I never thought that I would be when we were in the negative, And the second most powerful day is when we paid off our last non-mortgage debt, and we were able to pay ourselves back every pay period after that. So it's just so important. Listen to JL. Go get the Pathfinders book. Hey, JL, I appreciate you, man. I don't know if you have any more closing words. We can do this all day.
Yeah, we may never finish this conversation, so we'll let it go at that. But thanks so much for having me back. It's been a blast.
No problem, JL. Go get the book Pathfinders. Go get The Simple Path to Wealth after you've read Pathfinders, and then eventually go get How I Lost Money in Real Estate Before It Was Fashionable, Cautionary Tale. And I will always believe that if you could only choose a couple of books and you know nothing about finances, to choose JL's books. I mean, he's phenomenal at what he does. So JL, thank you so much again for coming on the channel, and I look forward to speaking with you in the near future. Okay.
Anytime you'll have me back.
All right. Thank you, sir. I appreciate you.
Right, man. Take care.
All right.
Bye now.